On the morning of September 2nd, 31st BC, 500 warships faced each other across the narrow strait at Actium, on the western coast of Greece. On one side stood the fleet of Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, commanding the military might of Rome's western provinces. On the other side stood the combined forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra VII, representing the wealth of Egypt and the legions of the East. The battle that followed would last only a few hours, but its consequences would reshape the entire Mediterranean world for the next 5 centuries. By sunset, Antony's fleet was burning or captured, his army was preparing to surrender, and the 3,000-year civilization of pharaonic Egypt had begun its final collapse. Historians have debated for 2 millennia what exactly happened during those crucial hours. Why Cleopatra's squadron suddenly broke through the enemy line and fled south, why Antony abandoned his own ships to follow her, why a battle that should have been evenly matched turned into a catastrophic rout. The ancient sources contradict each other, the archaeological evidence is incomplete, and the propaganda of the victor has obscured the facts almost beyond recovery. But piecing together what we can from the fragments that survive reveals a story far more complex than simple cowardice or betrayal. A story of strategic miscalculation, communication breakdown, and a desperate gamble that failed at the worst possible moment. Before we reconstruct the battle that ended an empire and examine the decisions that led to disaster, we need to understand how Antony and Cleopatra found themselves trapped at Actium in the first place. If you find stories of military catastrophe and ancient power struggles compelling, consider subscribing to join us as we uncover more of history's decisive moments. The road to Actium began 3 years earlier in 34 BC, when Mark Antony staged the donations of Alexandria and declared open rivalry with Octavian for control of the Roman world. The 2 men had been nominal allies since their victory over Caesar's assassins at Philippi in 42 BC, dividing the Roman territories between them, Octavian taking the west, Antony taking the east. But their alliance had always been uneasy, marked by mutual suspicion, broken agreements, and barely concealed contempt. Antony had married Octavian's sister Octavia as a political bond, then humiliated her by returning to Cleopatra and fathering 3 children with the Egyptian queen. Octavian had repeatedly failed to send promised troops for Antony's campaigns and had undermined Antony's reputation in Rome at every opportunity. By 32 BC, the pretense of partnership was over. Octavian read Antony's alleged will to the Roman Senate, claiming it proved Antony intended to give Roman territories to Cleopatra's children and be buried in Alexandria rather than Rome. The Senate declared war, officially against Cleopatra, not Antony, and both sides began preparing for the conflict that would determine who ruled the world. Antony's strategic position appeared strong as he assembled his forces in Greece during the winter of 32 to 31 BC. He had gathered approximately 100,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry, along with 500 warships, the largest military force ever concentrated in the eastern Mediterranean. His army included veteran legions that had served under Julius Caesar and fought with Antony himself across multiple campaigns. His fleet included massive warships of 8, 9, and even 10 banks of oars, floating fortresses that towered over the standard Roman triremes and quinqueremes. He had the wealth of Egypt to finance his campaign, the grain of the Nile Valley to feed his troops, and allies across the east who had pledged their support. Cleopatra herself accompanied the expedition with her own squadron of 60 ships and a war chest of treasure that would fund operations for years if necessary. The combined resources of Antony and Cleopatra dwarfed anything Octavian could immediately bring against them, and many observers expected that Antony would cross to Italy, defeat Octavian's forces, and claim sole control of the Roman Empire. But Antony made a strategic decision that would prove catastrophic. Instead of invading Italy immediately, he chose to wait in Greece and force Octavian to come to him. His reasoning was sound on paper. His supply lines would be shorter, his troops would be fresh, and Octavian would have to fight at the end of a long sea crossing with exhausted men and depleted supplies. Antony positioned his forces at Actium, a promontory on the southern entrance to the Ambracian Gulf, where he could control access to the Greek mainland and threaten Octavian's communications with Italy. He distributed his fleet and army along the western coast of Greece, establishing supply depots and fortified camps that would support his forces through the coming campaign. It was a defensive strategy that made sense against a weaker opponent, but it fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the enemy he faced. Octavian did not command his forces personally. He left military decisions to Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, the finest admiral of the age and one of the most brilliant tactical minds in Roman history. Agrippa had grown up with Octavian, shared his education, and devoted his life to his friend's cause. He had already proven himself in campaigns against Sextus Pompey in Sicily, where he had developed innovative naval tactics and technologies that would prove decisive at Actium. He understood that Antony's defensive position could be turned against him, and he designed a campaign to exploit every weakness in Antony's strategic situation. Instead of attacking the main fleet at Actium directly, Agrippa conducted a series of raids along the Greek coast, capturing supply depots, burning grain stores, and cutting off Antony's communications with his allies. He seized the island of Leucas and the town of Betrayal, closing off Antony's supply routes from the south. He captured Corinth and the Isthmus, preventing reinforcements from reaching Antony overland from the eastern provinces. He stationed squadrons at the mouth of the Ambracian Gulf, preventing Antony's ships from leaving to forage or resupply. Each move tightened the noose around Antony's forces, but none of them offered the pitched battle that Antony wanted and needed. Agrippa was fighting a war of attrition, and time was on his side. Within weeks of the campaign's opening, Agrippa had transformed Antony's defensive position into a trap, cutting off his supplies and isolating his forces at Actium while avoiding the decisive engagement that might have given Antony a chance to use his superior numbers. The situation at Actium deteriorated rapidly as summer turned to autumn, and Antony's supplies dwindled. The Ambracian Gulf was a swampy, malarial region, and disease began to spread through the crowded camps. Soldiers, weakened by hunger and sickness, could not maintain discipline or morale. Desertion became epidemic as officers and men concluded that Antony's cause was lost and slipped away to join Octavian. The client kings who had brought contingents to support Antony began to recalculate their positions, and several defected to Octavian, bringing valuable intelligence about Antony's plans and dispositions. Most damaging was the defection of Quintus Dellius, one of Antony's senior commanders, who brought detailed information about the strength and deployment of Antony's forces. By late August, Antony had lost perhaps a third of his army to disease, desertion, and defection, and the remainder was in no condition to fight effectively. Antony faced a desperate choice. He could stay at Actium and watch his army disintegrate, or he could attempt to break out by sea and regroup in Egypt where his supply situation would be more favorable. He chose to break out, but this decision created immediate conflicts with his officers and with Cleopatra. Some of his Roman commanders urged him to abandon the fleet entirely, march his army overland to Macedonia or Thrace, and continue the war on land where Roman legions had always excelled. Cleopatra insisted that the fleet must be preserved because it represented Egyptian power and because her treasury was loaded on her ships. If the fleet was lost, Egypt's ability to continue the war would be severely compromised. Antony sided with Cleopatra, but his decision to save the fleet instead of the army alienated many of his Roman officers, who saw it as further proof that he had subordinated Roman interests to Egyptian influence. The plan that emerged was a hybrid that satisfied no one completely. Antony would engage Octavian's fleet with his main force, attempting to win a victory that would break the blockade and restore his strategic position. If victory proved impossible, he would create a gap in Octavian's line through which Cleopatra's squadron could escape with the treasury, followed by as many of his own ships as could break free. The army would be left to march overland under the command of Publius Canidius Crassus, with instructions to retreat to Asia and await further orders. This plan required precise timing, clear communication, and favorable conditions, requirements that would all fail on the day of battle. It also required Antony to fight a naval engagement with undermanned ships against a superior tactical commander, which was essentially asking for a miracle. The morning of September 2nd dawned clear after several days of bad weather that had prevented either fleet from putting to sea. Antony had been waiting for the right wind conditions to execute his escape plan, and the delay had given his already demoralized forces more time to deteriorate. He reportedly burned many of his own ships before the battle because he did not have enough healthy rowers to man them, a desperate measure that showed how badly his situation had deteriorated since he arrived at Actium with 500 warships just months earlier. The ships he kept were the largest and most powerful, but they were crewed by sailors who were sick, hungry, and exhausted. Many of them soldiers who had been pressed into service as rowers because so many professional oarsmen had died or deserted. Antony led his ships out of the Gulf in 3 squadrons. He commanded the right wing, Gaius Sosius commanded the left, and Marcus Octavius and Marcus Instaius commanded the center. Cleopatra's 60 Egyptian ships formed a 4th squadron behind the main line, waiting for the opportunity to break through if the battle created an opening. Octavian's fleet was also arranged in 3 squadrons, with Agrippa commanding the left wing opposite Antony, Lucius Aruntius commanding the center, and Octavian himself nominally commanding the right wing, though Agrippa was making the actual tactical decisions. The 2 fleets faced each other across the open water for hours, neither willing to initiate combat, each waiting for the other to make a mistake. Antony needed to lure Octavian's ships away from the shore to create an opening for Cleopatra's escape. Octavian's forces were content to wait, knowing that time was their ally and that Antony's situation grew more desperate with every passing hour. The battle began around midday when Antony's left wing advanced against Agrippa's position, attempting to outflank the enemy line. Agrippa responded by extending his own line, and both fleets gradually spread northward as each tried to gain the advantageous position. This extension created gaps in the center of both lines, and the fighting degenerated into a series of individual ship-to-ship combats rather than the coordinated fleet action that Antony needed. His massive warships had advantages in these close engagements. Their height allowed soldiers to fire down on enemy decks, and their weight made them difficult to ram or board. But they were also slow and undermanned, and they could be surrounded by multiple smaller ships that attacked from different directions simultaneously. Agrippa's lighter, faster ships swarmed around the enemy giants, throwing grappling hooks, shooting fire arrows, and wearing down crews that were already weakened by months of disease and short rations. Agrippa employed a revolutionary weapon that gave his fleet a decisive advantage: the harpax, a catapult-launched grappling hook that could seize an enemy ship from a distance and haul it in for boarding. Traditional grappling required ships to come alongside each other, which gave Antony's larger vessels the advantage. The harpax allowed Agrippa's smaller ships to snare the enemy giants from a safer distance, then reel them in, while other ships attacked from different angles. Antony's towers and heavy catapults could not defend against attacks coming from multiple directions, and his undermanned crews could not simultaneously fight off boarders, extinguish fires, and work the oars. The technology was simple, but the tactical implications were profound. It transformed the battle from a contest of ship sizes to a contest of numbers to coordination, which Agrippa won decisively. The fire was devastating. Agrippa's ships launched volleys of fire arrows and incendiary projectiles at Antony's wooden giants, and the flames spread rapidly through rigging and sails that had been baked dry by months of Mediterranean sun. Antony had ordered his ships to carry their sails, which was unusual for battle because the escape plan required the ability to run before the wind. But the sails made perfect targets for fire attack, and once ablaze, they spread flames to the decks and oars beneath. Several of Antony's largest ships became floating infernos, their crews jumping into the sea to escape the flames, their bronze rams and towers eventually slipping beneath the waves as the hulls burned through. The smoke from these burning ships would have been visible for miles, a signal to everyone watching from shore that Antony's fleet was being destroyed. The moment that decided the battle came perhaps 2 hours after fighting began, when Cleopatra's squadron suddenly raised its sails and drove through the gap in the center of the battle line, heading south at full speed toward open water. The Roman sources present this as cowardice or betrayal. Cleopatra fleeing the battle in panic, and Antony following her like a lovesick fool, abandoning his men to die. But the evidence suggests something different. The escape was almost certainly prearranged, the backup plan that Antony and Cleopatra had agreed upon if the battle went badly. Cleopatra was carrying the treasury, and saving that treasure was essential for continuing the war from Egypt. Her ships were undermanned like the rest of the fleet, and they were not designed for the kind of close combat that was developing. Breaking through the enemy line while a gap existed and the Egyptian squadron was still intact made strategic sense, even if the timing was earlier than Antony had hoped. Antony's decision to follow Cleopatra has been condemned as the moment of his ruin, the act that proved his enslavement to the Egyptian queen. This condemnation has some merit. By abandoning his flagship and racing after Cleopatra in a fast galley, Antony effectively ended the battle and guaranteed the destruction of his remaining fleet. His ships were still fighting when he left, and many of them continued to fight for hours after his departure, not realizing that their commander was gone. But Antony may have calculated that the battle was already lost, that his undermanned ships could not defeat Agrippa's superior tactics, and that his only chance was to escape with whatever forces he could save and continue the war from Egypt. He took about 40 ships with him when he broke through the enemy line, a significant force that could form the nucleus of a new fleet. The calculation was not irrational, but it was wrong. By fleeing, Antony destroyed his reputation and his army's morale far more thoroughly than a defeat in battle would have done. The aftermath of Actium was a cascading catastrophe that destroyed everything Antony had built. His fleet, left without commander or direction, fought on until evening before surrendering or being destroyed. Sources disagree on the losses, but perhaps 200 of his ships were captured or burned, and thousands of sailors and soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. His land army, waiting on shore under Canidius Crassus, received news of the naval defeat and Antony's flight within hours. Canidius urged the soldiers to march east and continue the campaign, but the legions refused. Their commander had abandoned them. Their fleet was destroyed. Their cause was clearly lost. Within a week, the entire army, 19 legions of veteran soldiers, surrendered to Octavian without fighting. It was one of the largest mass surrenders in Roman military history, and it happened not because Antony lost a battle, but because he ran away from one. Antony and Cleopatra reached Egypt with their surviving ships and their treasury intact, but they returned to a kingdom that was already collapsing. News of Actium spread across the Mediterranean within weeks, and every ally and client king who had supported their cause rushed to make peace with Octavian. The governor of Cyrenaica defected. The legions stationed in Syria surrendered. King Herod of Judea, who owed his throne to Antony's support, switched sides and offered his services to Octavian. Egypt itself remained loyal, but Egypt alone could not resist the combined power of the Roman world now unified under Octavian's command. Antony fell into depression and paranoia, alternating between desperate schemes to rally resistance and fatalistic acceptance of defeat. He built a small house on a pier in Alexandria harbor, which he called the Timoneum, after Timon of Athens, the famous misanthrope who had withdrawn from human society in disgust. There he brooded on his losses, on the betrayals that had destroyed him, on the flight from Actium that had turned victory into catastrophe. Cleopatra tried everything to save her kingdom and her children. She sent ambassadors to Octavian offering to abdicate in favor of her children if they would be allowed to rule under Roman supervision. She reportedly tried to have her fleet dragged overland from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, hoping to escape to India beyond Roman reach. She executed the governors and officers she suspected of planning to defect, but the executions only accelerated the collapse of loyalty. She gathered her treasury in her mausoleum, surrounded by flammable materials, and let Octavian know that she would burn the wealth of Egypt rather than let him have it, a threat that may have bought her time to negotiate but could not change the ultimate outcome. Through all of this, she maintained her composure and her dignity, showing the Roman world that the Queen of Egypt would not beg or grovel, even in defeat. The end came in August of 30 BC, almost exactly 1 year after Actium. Octavian's legions arrived outside Alexandria, and Antony's remaining forces deserted or surrendered. Antony fell on his sword after receiving false news that Cleopatra was dead, and died in her arms after being carried to her monument. Cleopatra survived him by a few days, negotiating with Octavian while secretly preparing her suicide. She died on August 12th, probably by poison, denying Octavian the triumph he wanted and the spectacle of the last queen of Egypt dragged through Rome in chains. Her son Caesarion was hunted down and killed. Her 3 children by Antony were taken to Rome and raised by Octavian's sister. Egypt became a Roman province, directly controlled by the emperor, and the 3,000-year tradition of pharaonic rule came to an end. The Battle of Actium has been remembered as a decisive victory, a masterpiece of naval tactics that demonstrated Octavian's military genius. But Octavian was not present in any meaningful command capacity. The victory belonged to Agrippa, whose patient strategy and superior seamanship turned Antony's strength into weakness. The battle has also been remembered as proof of Antony's incompetence and Cleopatra's corrupting influence, evidence that the great general had been destroyed by his passion for the Eastern Queen. But this interpretation is largely the product of Octavian's propaganda, which had every reason to attribute the defeat to personal failings rather than strategic circumstances. The truth is more complex and more interesting. Actium was a battle that Antony should never have fought, in a position he should never have occupied, against a commander who outmaneuvered him at every turn. The defeat was not caused by cowardice or betrayal, but by a series of decisions that seemed reasonable individually, but combined to create a catastrophic outcome. The flight from Actium was probably the right decision in purely military terms. Cleopatra saved the treasury, Antony saved a portion of his fleet, and both reached Egypt with resources that could have supported continued resistance. But war is not fought only with ships and money. It is fought with morale, with reputation, with the confidence that soldiers and allies have in their commanders. By fleeing Actium, Antony and Cleopatra destroyed something that could not be rebuilt with gold or galleys, the belief that they could win. Their allies abandoned them not because the military situation was hopeless, but because their flight proved that they themselves had given up hope. The battle was lost not on September 2nd, but in the weeks that followed, as the entire eastern Mediterranean concluded that Antony was finished and rushed to make terms with Octavian. The legacy of Actium extended far beyond the immediate political consequences of Octavian's victory. The battle marked the effective end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire, though Octavian would maintain republican forms for another 4 years before accepting the title Augustus and establishing the Principate. It marked the end of Egyptian independence and the incorporation of the Nile Valley into the Roman provincial system, where it would remain for 7 centuries until the Arab conquest. It marked the end of the Hellenistic period in Mediterranean history, the final destruction of the kingdoms carved from Alexander the Great's empire 3 centuries earlier, and it marked the end of Cleopatra's line, the extinction of the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt since Alexander's general Ptolemy claimed the kingdom in 305 BC. The site of the battle became a monument to Octavian's victory, marked by a trophy displaying the bronze rams captured from Antony's ships and a sanctuary to Apollo, the god that Octavian claimed as his divine patron. The city of Nicopolis, City of Victory, was founded nearby, populated by settlers from the surrounding region and granted special privileges in honor of the occasion. Annual games were established to commemorate the battle, celebrated for centuries afterward as the moment when Rome was saved from Eastern tyranny. Octavian understood that Actium was not just a military victory, but a symbolic one, and he invested enormous resources in making sure that the symbolism was preserved and transmitted to future generations. 2,000 years later, historians continue to debate what actually happened in those crucial hours on September 31st BC. The sources are contradictory, the physical evidence is limited, and the propaganda of the victor colors everything we think we know. Archaeological surveys of the seabed have found bronze rams and other artifacts, but not enough to reconstruct the battle in detail. The site itself has changed over 2 millennia, with the coastline shifting and the harbor silting up. We will probably never know exactly what orders Antony gave, exactly what Cleopatra saw that made her decide the moment had come, exactly how the signal was communicated, or whether there was a signal at all. But this much is clear. The Battle of Actium was the end of an era and the beginning of a new one, the moment when the ancient world pivoted from republic to empire, from Hellenistic kingdoms to Roman provinces, from Cleopatra's Egypt to Augustus's Rome. The 500 ships that clashed in the strait that morning carried the fate of millions, and when the fighting was over, that fate was sealed. The 3,000-year civilization of the pharaohs had less than a year to live. Antony and Cleopatra had less than a year to live. And the world they had tried to build together, the partnership between Rome and Egypt that might have created a different kind of Mediterranean order, died with them. Actium decided everything, and nothing that came after could undo what happened on that single September day.